So 60 seconds ago, Donald Trump went on Truth Social and called Canada's dairy industry a disgrace. He said Canadian dairy farmers are protected by walls so high that American farmers cannot even see over them. He said the supply management system that governs Canadian milk, cheese, butter, and poultry production is the single most unfair trade arrangement in the entire North American relationship. He called it a hidden tax on American farmers. He called it a rigged market. He called it, and this is the phrase that set off everything that followed, a deliberate act of agricultural theft against the United States. And Mark Carney, who was in the middle of a parliamentary question period when the Post went live, was handed a printed copy by an aide, read it for approximately 15 seconds, sat it down, and responded with something that Washington was not prepared for. Not anger, not defensiveness, not a diplomatic non-answer carefully crafted to avoid escalation. Facts. Specific, sourced, statistically precise facts delivered in the calm and unhurried manner of a former central banker who has spent his entire career making high-stakes arguments to audiences that require evidence rather than emotion. Hit that like button right now and subscribe, because what just happened in the next 30 minutes of that parliamentary session is one of the most remarkable exchanges in modern North American political history. And the substance of what Carney actually said demolishes every one of Trump's claims so completely that even conservative Canadian economists are calling it the most effective trade policy rebuttal they have ever witnessed. Let me fill you in on the background. You need to understand why this specific fight matters so much, because dairy is not just dairy in this context. It is the proxy battle for a much larger argument about whether Canada has the sovereign right to organize its domestic economy according to its own values and priorities, or whether American export interests have a claim on Canadian market structure that overrides Canadian democratic choices. Canada's supply management system has existed since the early 1970s. It covers milk, cream, butter, cheese, yogurt, chicken, turkey, and eggs. The system works through three interlocking mechanisms. Production quotas limit how much each farmer can produce. Import controls limit how much foreign products can enter the Canadian market. And price controls stabilize what farmers receive for their output. The system was designed to do something specific, and it has done it with extraordinary consistency for 50 years. Keep Canadian family farms financially viable by ensuring that the price farmers receive for their products covers the cost of producing them. It is not a subsidy in the conventional sense. The Canadian government does not write checks to dairy farmers. It manages market structure in a way that allows farmers to plan, invest, and operate with the kind of income certainty that unmanaged commodity markets categorically cannot provide. And here is where things get interesting, because the system has produced outcomes that the American agricultural model, for all its scale and productivity, has consistently failed to achieve. Canadian dairy farms are predominantly family-owned and family-operated. The average Canadian dairy farm has been in continuous family operation for over 30 years. Canadian dairy farmers are not wealthy by the standards of the broader economy, but they are financially stable, able to service debt, invest in their operations, send their children to university, and retire with dignity. That stability is not accidental. It is the designed output of a system that treats food production as a social good as well as a commercial activity. Now, here is where the rubber meets the road. Because Trump's complaint about Canadian dairy is not actually about consumer prices or trade fairness in the way his post suggests. It is about market access for American dairy producers who are operating in a fundamentally different system, one characterized by industrial scale, commodity price volatility, and a chronic overproduction problem that has driven American dairy farm bankruptcies to levels not seen since the Great Depression. The United States lost approximately 50% of its dairy farms between 2003 and 2023. American dairy farmers receive prices for their milk that frequently fall below the cost of production, surviving only through direct federal subsidy payments that the American government dispersed at a rate of over $6 billion annually in recent years. The American dairy system is not more efficient than the Canadian one in any meaningful sense. It is larger. It produces more milk per farm, but it does so by concentrating production in industrial operations that have hollowed out rural dairy communities across the Midwest and the Northeast, and it relies on federal support payments, actual government checks to actual farmers, at a scale that Canadian supply management has never required. When Carney received Trump's post and read it at the parliamentary dispatch box, he began his response by acknowledging the concern directly and without defensiveness. He said that Canadian dairy policy was a legitimate subject of bilateral discussion, and that Canada had always been prepared to discuss it in the appropriate forum, which was a trade negotiation, not a social media post. That line got a laugh from the Canadian side of the chamber and an uncomfortable silence from the opposition. Then Carney got to the facts, and the facts are worth laying out in full because they are the part of this story that is not getting adequate coverage in American media. First, Carney pointed out that Canada does provide American dairy products with tariff-free access up to specific quota thresholds that were negotiated and agreed upon in CUSMA, the trade agreement that the Trump administration itself signed in 2020 and has repeatedly described as a great deal for American farmers. The United States exports approximately $700 million in dairy products to Canada every year under those quota provisions. That market access exists because Canada agreed to it. It is not a concession that was extracted from Canada under duress. It was a negotiated outcome that both governments accepted. If Trump's administration believes those thresholds should be expanded, the mechanism for that conversation is a trade negotiation, the same customer review process that Washington recently complicated by attaching unrelated preconditions to Canada's participation. Second, Carney noted that the United States provides its own dairy industry with federal support payments, crop insurance programs, and export subsidy mechanisms that collectively amount to billions of dollars annually in government transfers to American dairy producers. The specific figure he cited, $6.2 billion in direct and indirect federal support to the American dairy sector in the most recent fiscal year, for which complete data is available, landed in the room with the force of a precision instrument because it reframes the entire argument. Trump's complaint is that Canada protects its dairy farmers through supply management. Carney's response is that America protects its dairy farmers through direct federal subsidies. Both systems protect their farmers. They just use different mechanisms. Calling one system protectionist while defending the other as free market agriculture is not an economic argument. It is a political one, and it does not survive contact with the actual numbers. Third, and this is the part that genuinely stunned the room, Carney cited the comparative outcome data. Canadian dairy farm bankruptcies over the past 20 years, essentially zero. The supply management system has not produced a single wave of dairy farm closures comparable to what the American system has experienced. Canadian dairy farm consolidation over the same period, modest and gradual, driven by generational succession rather than financial distress. American dairy farm closures over the same 20 years, approximately 60,000 operations, representing half of all American dairy farms that existed at the start of the period. Carney looked directly at the camera and said, with the precise cadence of someone who knows exactly what he is doing, that before a country lectures its neighbor about agricultural policy, it might want to examine whether its own system is actually working for its own farmers. The opposition benches erupted. The government benches were very quiet, which in parliamentary terms means the point landed exactly as intended. Now, this is where it gets genuinely extraordinary because Carney did not stop at defending supply management. He went further. He connected the dairy dispute directly to the broader pattern of American trade pressure that Canada has been navigating for 2 years. And he made an argument that reframes the entire bilateral relationship in terms that are uncomfortable for Washington to contest. He said that every Canadian trade policy that Washington labels as protectionist has a direct American equivalent that Washington labels as smart policy. Supply management is protectionist. American dairy subsidies are farmer support. Canadian steel protection is an unfair trade barrier. American steel tariffs are national security. Canadian pharmaceutical pricing regulation is market distortion. American pharmaceutical patent extensions are innovation incentives. Carney said that Canada was entirely willing to have a serious conversation about any of these policies in any context where the same standard was applied to both nations simultaneously. What Canada was not willing to do was accept a framework in which American trade interventions were treated as legitimate exercises of sovereign economic policy, while Canadian trade interventions were treated as violations of a free trade principle that the United States itself had not practiced for decades. That argument, precise, even-handed, and impossible to refute without acknowledging the double standard, is not the argument of a government on the defensive. It is the argument of a government that has decided the old diplomatic habit of absorbing American criticism without systematic rebuttal is over. The political reaction in Canada was immediate and cut across partisan lines in ways that matter electorally. Conservative members of Parliament from rural dairy-riding constituencies where supply management is not an abstract trade policy question but the economic foundation of family farms that have operated for generations, found themselves in the unusual position of having nothing to criticize in a Liberal Prime Minister's trade response. Several issued statements of qualified support for Carney's factual rebuttal while maintaining their broader political opposition. The National Farmers Union called the parliamentary response the most effective public defense of supply management they had witnessed from any prime minister in the system's 50-year history. The dairy farmers of Canada issued a statement noting that Carney had cited every figure accurately and had correctly described both the structure and the outcomes of the system. Even agricultural economists who have published critiques of supply management's effects on Canadian consumer food prices acknowledged that the comparative framing, Canadian farm stability versus American farm bankruptcy rates, was factually accurate and rhetorically devastating. Washington's response followed the now familiar pattern. The White House press secretary called Carney's parliamentary remarks combative and unhelpful to the bilateral relationship. The U.S. Trade Representative's office issued a statement reiterating that Canadian dairy barriers cost American farmers billions in lost market access annually and calling for comprehensive reform of supply management in any future trade framework. Trump posted 3 additional statements across the afternoon, each reiterating the original complaint with escalating language and decreasing specificity. No new tariff was announced. No formal trade action was initiated. The gap between rhetorical escalation and concrete policy response remained as it has throughout this entire 18-month saga, the defining characteristic of Washington's engagement with Carney's Canada. Here is what this specific exchange reveals about where the broader relationship now stands. The dairy fight is not really about dairy. It is a test case for a much larger question that both governments are answering simultaneously through their conduct in every bilateral interaction. The question is whether Canada will continue to absorb American criticism of its domestic economic policies without systematic factual rebuttal, or whether the Carney government has permanently changed the terms of engagement by responding to every American attack with specific, sourced, comparative evidence that contextualizes Canadian policy within American practice. The answer that the parliamentary dairy exchange provides is unambiguous. The old diplomatic deference is gone, not replaced by hostility, not replaced by confrontation for its own sake, replaced by something that is in some ways more challenging for Washington to manage than either of those responses. Replaced by facts delivered calmly, without apology, with comparative context that makes the double standard visible and impossible to ignore. Because the most powerful argument in any bilateral trade dispute is not the one that shouts the loudest. It is the one that demonstrates with specific numbers and documented outcomes that the critic's own system produces worse results by the very standards the critic is applying. Carney made that argument today in front of the Canadian Parliament, the Canadian media, and the watching international community. He made it about dairy, but the structure of the argument, that sovereign nations have the right to organize their domestic economies according to their own values, and that no nation protecting its own farmers through billions in direct subsidies has standing to demand that its neighbor abandon farmer protection through market structure, applies to steel, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, clean energy, and every other sector where Washington has applied pressure. So here is where we stand. Trump called Canadian dairy policy an act of agricultural theft. Carney responded with the quota access figures that Canada provides under CUSMA, the $6.2 billion in annual federal support that the American dairy system receives, the 60,000 American dairy farm closures over 20 years, and the essentially zero Canadian dairy farm failures over the same period. He connected the dairy defense to the broader principle that no nation practicing its own forms of agricultural support has standing to demand that its neighbor abandon theirs. Washington called it combative. Canadian farmers called it accurate. Markets registered it as another data point in a pattern that is now 18 months long and showing no signs of reversal. The facts were always available. What changed is that Canada is now using them loudly, precisely, without apology, and in the most visible parliamentary forum available. If this breakdown helped you understand what is really at stake beneath the dairy headlines, hit the like button, drop a comment telling us whether you think Washington has any factual response to Carney's numbers, and subscribe right now because this story is moving fast and the next exchange is already forming.